Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here's Shehan J. Haraja and Bobak Hayeri.
Hey everybody, it's been a busy beginning to the offseason with the coaching carousel spinning back up only a few days after the title game when Nick Saban, the greatest living coach, decided to hang up the clipboard. It's got us thinking about how the playoff has affected coaching searches, particularly with the arrival of the 12-team playoff. Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where we're all about the College Football Playoff Championship, the race for it, and the future of it as we are now in the offseason. I'm Bobak Hayeri, and I'm joined as always by Shehan J. Haraja, national college football writer for CBS Sports. You can find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show, where we have video highlights of the show, run polls, and listen to your feedback. Take a moment to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your shows. We enjoy your reviews. If they're interesting, we might even talk about them on the show. So we're now a decade into the college football playoff era. Plenty of time and material to look back on and think about how the dynamic of fighting for those four spots colored the coaching carousel. And at the dawn of the dozen-team era, think about how things are going to change even further. I just want to take a second to recap the last week's coaching changes and we don't have full answers to everything as of this recording on a Wednesday morning. Alabama, obviously, as I mentioned, Nick Saban retired. They took Washington's coach, Kalen DeBoer. Washington then cast a line and got Jedd Fisch from Arizona. Arizona then took San Jose State's Brent Brennan. So now San Jose State is an open position. South Alabama lost Kane Womack, who's now the defensive coordinator at Alabama. So South Alabama is now open. And Buffalo's open because their head coach was also poached to join the Alabama staff. And we still have the team we were more expecting to be talking about. Still, we're waiting to see what Jim Harbaugh is going to do, if he's going to stay at Michigan or if he's going to take one of these NFL positions. He's now, sounds like, interviewed for at least two teams, and we'll see where that goes. But as we dive into this, Shehan, what are your initial thoughts on kind of where we are coaching searches in the playoff era?
Well, I think what's so interesting about this situation is that there are essentially going to be two cycles because one guy retired. And so we see, like you said, a change at Washington because of it. We see a change at Arizona. We see a change at San Jose State. We see a change at Buffalo. We see a change at South Alabama, all related to that one guy deciding he's ready to retire. And that says a lot about who Nick Saban is. It says a lot about the staff that Kalen DeBoer is assembling at Alabama. But it's crazy. And what happens as well whenever this all happens is that whenever a coach leaves a job, it opens up a portal window for all of their players. But the flip side is that Alabama and Washington and Arizona and all these schools don't have the ability to take from other schools because the rest of the portal window has already come through. And so it's such a fascinating dynamic. It's, truly nothing like I think we've almost ever seen. For whatever you want to say about some of these changes a couple of years ago, right? I know that Oklahoma fans, for example, they gave Lincoln Riley hell for when he left and the players that entered the portal. The other side of that was that he left in late November. So it was before, I think this was before we had official portal windows. But so he was able to, Brent Venables was able to come in and get a bunch of transfers to come back his way. That's not something that Alabama is going to have the ability to do, at least when it comes to getting players on campus before spring. Now, remember, there is a post-spring portal window. I would expect Alabama to be incredibly active during that window with adding players. I think that they'll, look, this is the reality of college football. They'll probably back channel with a lot of players during this spring period and try to show that there's opportunity potentially at Alabama. And I want to be clear, too. They have a lot of good players coming back. Jihad Campbell was one at weak side linebacker, a great player for them. He said, I'm not leaving. Jalen Milroe has not entered the portal at this point. They still have good wide receivers. They still have good linemen. Cade Proctor's one. And by the way, we're recording this midday on Wednesday. More players might have entered the portal by the time you hear this. Yeah. But the timing of this is so weird. And this takes me kind of a step back, which is the most broken thing about the sport is not NIL, it's not the transfer portal, it's not any of these things. It's the calendar. It's just the freaking calendar. We see, back like in 2021, right? We see LSU hire Brian Kelly and make him leave before he even knows if his team is in the college football playoff, which was a possibility that year. So the fact that like we are moving so fast that you have to already be worried about the next thing before you're even done with your current thing, that is a ridiculous, insane situation. I think the other part too that we have to think about is with Alabama, and let's say as well with Michigan. Let's just say Jim Harbaugh leaves. Nothing's happened as yet. He's interviewing for jobs. But if he leaves, well, again, the portal window will open up for Michigan's roster. They won't be able to pull kids back most likely because most are already shut off from being able to enter the portal. And so in a weird way, playing in the national championship game will actually be a huge disadvantage to Michigan and to Washington because their portal windows will open up so much later than everybody else's. And so it's a bizarre situation. It's the issue with all of this is I don't know exactly what the answer is. Everybody's like, we'll just push back the portal windows until later, maybe, separate. I do think that the early signing period should go. That's not something that should be going at the same time as everything else. But you are running into legitimate add drop deadlines for classes, right? Where if a kid transfers to Alabama right now, like the drop deadline might have already passed. And so like you can't enroll at Alabama at this point as a university. So there's not a great answer to this question. I mean, I don't know. What are your thoughts on this? As an academic, by the way.
Does Alabama shift to a quarter system so they can kind of have more slots for people to follow? Can you imagine an athletic department for college football forcing more schools to go to a quarter system so that they can find better spots for players to kind of become students again? But I agree the calendar is broken, but my approach to it is a little different. I decided I don't think it can be entirely fixed. So instead of, and I'm not saying you're going too far in this, but instead of like some of the folks I hear who are decrying it as like the fall of whatever civilization, it still supports guys. But, I actually lean into it. I'm like, this is crazy. I love the chaos. I love the fact that it isn't great for reporting and having to worry about keep track of so many things. And certainly the head coaches have to keep track of so much. But as a fan, I really don't know what's going to happen next. As a person who observes college football, like what's going to happen? Like if you're a person who enjoys a sport, you don't know if the players you're into are going to leave or you're suddenly going to get a good player. Granted, this is more in the favor of the top programs. So if you're a program that is always being poached, you're just constantly living in maybe a state of fear. But I really think that at this point, we just have to kind of accept the fact that college football is messy, disorganized. A lot of things I didn't think would happen have happened over the last few years in terms of making the sport more player-centric and giving them more opportunities. But I ultimately think this is truly like hurting hundreds of cats at this point. I don't know if we'll ever be able to organize everyone. I don't think the NCAA has the wherewithal to do it. I mean, short of, and I grant the more I talk about it, there could be a situation where either what Charlie Baker proposed or some alternate proposal takes the top teams and puts them into their own division or their own conference, their own league, however you want to phrase it, where they can kind of regulate all of this in a way that they all agree to. But even then, it is such a pain to get people to agree. I mean, imagine getting Notre Dame to agree to just anything, or the Rose Bowl to agree to just anything. We've shown how this sport just doesn't want to listen to each other unless things get completely desperate. I think the best move is to just accept the fact that, this is completely broken, and that's part of the charm. That is part of the charm. It's the same reason why the on-field play, for those of us who are really into college football, obviously, us here and most of you listening, it's the fact that, it is not a homogenous style of play, that teams have to play differently based on their talent. Everyone is certainly not NFL caliber in college football, so mistakes happen, and it adds to the wackiness of the games. I think we're going to have to accept it off the field too. We're going to have to accept the fact that if you're a college football fan, the calendar's broken. Things are going to happen that don't make sense. And you just have to kind of enjoy the ride. And it adds a little bit of chaos, a little bit of variability into all of it.
Well, I think that another factor to take with this is, again, the conversation is focused on Nick Saban and Alabama for obvious reasons. But this will potentially become a Jim Harbaugh conversation as well. And I think that what's also curious about this is that there has been more overlap between college and pro staffs in this era than in any I can remember in a long time. I can't remember the name right now. USC just had, I believe it's Eric Henderson, the Los Angeles Rams defensive line coach. He just joined in the same position, right? Because in some cases, there's as much or more money in college jobs as there are in pro jobs. So people go back and forth all the time. And we've seen this even with, of course, Matt Rule a couple of years ago at Baylor goes to the NFL. We might see this with Jim Harbaugh. We've seen this happen before. I think, Doug Marrone, right, went from college to the NFL. It happens. But the NFL hiring cycle is so insane and different than the college one. So you're in a situation where now Jim Harbaugh, if he gets hired, might get hired on like January 23rd, whereas the college hiring cycle happened on like December 2nd. That's crazy. And I don't think that's something that's palatable. Now, it's also worth noting that something that we're always going to say is, hey, you know what? Like, they need to fix this. They need to fix, but there's no they. That's the issue.
Yeah, who's going to fix it?
Nobody's in charge. And that's, of course, the fundamental thing. And we've harped on that for, since we started doing this podcast, that nobody's in charge. But I do think that that's ultimately something that needs to change, whether it's through legislation, whether it's through the NCAA restructuring, whether it's through an organization like the College Football Playoff taking over. I think that everybody kind of acknowledges there needs to be, to the lowest extent, some level of national, or total sports governance, I guess you could call it. I think that another part of this is let's shift a little and look forward to the 12-team playoff. If I'm not mistaken, next year, the national championship game will take place on January 20th in Atlanta.
Yep.
That is so much later than we are used to. It's going to be something to have the national championship game following up Inauguration Day. That's going to be something. But I think that the other piece of this is that I've always been a big proponent of the fact that programs should be judged on success for that program. I don't think if you're an Arizona fan, or if you're an Oklahoma State fan, or if you're, whatever, right? I think that to sit and try to judge every program on, well, are they going to win a national championship is just a dumb way to watch the sport, right? Like no San Diego State fan is like, well, we didn't beat Alabama this year. That's not how you judge success. But I think what becomes interesting in the 12-team playoff is how this will impact the coach hiring and firing cycle. Because you have a situation like, let's take James Franklin at Penn State. It's okay to be worse than Ohio State and Michigan in the Big Ten, but now you should be in the playoff every year with what you've built there, with the salary that you're getting, with the opportunity that you have. And once you get to the playoff, you also should be able to win one or two games. You should be able to play, obviously this year they played Ole Miss and lost. That's a game that you should be winning more times than not. Maybe you're a 6 or a 7 seed. You should be able to beat the number 2 team from the Big 12 or the number 4 team from the SEC. And so now I think that the idea of being pretty good and winning 9 or 10 games and playing in a bowl game that for whatever reason we've told ourselves we shouldn't care about, which is I think is silly, but that's another conversation. Well, now all of a sudden, I think that the bar for a lot of sort of more, I don't want to call them second tier jobs or mid tier jobs, but jobs that are below the super duper elite of the elite, or situations that are lower than that, right? All of a sudden, I think that those programs I mean, again, I think you add like a Texas A&M into that mix. I think that you add, I mean, even Texas right now, like with what they've done. I think they Ole Miss, right? Washington and Oregon. Like
Tennessee.
these are teams, Tennessee, yeah. These are teams that should expect to compete for the playoff every single year, or at least every other year, or maybe like, make it maybe once every 3 years. That's what the expectation is going to be at these places. And that's a blessing in terms of, I think it's more attainable than it was before. But oh boy, could that soon become a curse too?
Yeah, it's interesting, especially when you consider, I mean, with obviously Saban's kicked off a lot of this thinking. How long ago it was when he was hired? I mean, in the sense he was hired in the BCS era when the pressure was to be one of the top two teams because you had to make it into the championship game, which was a higher set of pressure than there perhaps was prior to it when you really were just trying to get to, if you're a Pac-12 team, Pac-10 team, pardon me, trying to get to the Rose Bowl as well as the Big Ten. And if there was a chance you might win the championship, it really was a bit out of your hands. BCS era, a lot of stress to get to those top two spots. And then the 14 playoff, it got me thinking, because we talked about it earlier. Nick Saban made 8 of the 10 playoffs, which is just a stunning statement. And that was a level of expectation that he had created. For a lot of teams, though, it was just the idea of getting to the playoff. Teams like Oklahoma kept getting to the playoff. Notre Dame would get to the playoff. Pac-12 had trouble getting to the playoff. It made me think about like who is benefiting the most. Clearly, I think we can say the SEC benefited the most, and that perhaps was the strength of the conference during that era. But and towards the end, we started to also get a chance to taste how the portal and NIL also affected the way we thought of teams and who has an ability to get there and what we look for in the kinds of coaches who can put together teams. I mean, you could argue Kalen DeBoer was the ultimate version of that. Good coach, knew how to use the portal, got a couple of key players, and boom, they nearly made it all the way to the end. They got into the title game, and now he's head coach of Alabama, which was kind of an interesting passing of the torch. It makes me now think about the 12-team playoff and how that's going to affect expectations. Because as you mentioned, there's teams that are going to have a lot more pressure put on them. For all the conversation that this is to the benefit of James Franklin, is it? Because as you pointed out, is it enough just to get into the playoff for him, or does he have to win a game or two? Same, arguably, for Lane Kiffin. He's kind of the equivalent in the SEC. And then you start thinking about certain coaches who were pleasing, I think, the fan base, pleasing the alumni, just occasionally getting the New Year's Six, and doing well enough. And I started thinking about Mike Gundy, like at Oklahoma State, are they going to now expect, an at-large bid, which would be perhaps a little tougher being in the Big 12, or like Mac Brown at North Carolina. Like they're in the Big 12 and the ACC, but they're not quite the level of the SEC and Big 12. Pardon me, the Big 10 for fighting for that kind of that large bid, which will be, again, a bit of a beauty contest, a bit of a perception contest, something that arguably was affecting the 14 playoff in the SEC. And then, second-tier programs, and I mean, I'm not trying to say that derogatorily, but the ones that are always constantly not quite able to make it to the top, the Tennessee and the Texas A&M, or the forever expectations at Nebraska that they will return to relevance. Is that going to put extra pressure on those guys? And coaches who go to those teams that know you really do have to be able to make it to the playoff on a regular basis. The thing that really struck me, I think we have to reframe how coaches at power conferences talk about their expectations. Historically, I don't care who it was, Nick Saban, Bill Belichick, my God, Pete Carroll, whoever it was. It's like, our goal is to just win the conference. Our goal is to win the Pac-12. Our goal is to win the Big 12, win the ACC, win the SEC. That almost goes out the window now, because to win a conference means you're automatically in the playoff. The idea of winning a conference now has been subsumed by our goal is to make the playoff by winning the conference. That is at best the way you can phrase it. So the playoff, the 12-team playoff, has absolutely changed expectations for head coaches. And I wonder if we're going to see a shift in how coaches talk about it. With Bill Belichick now available, it would be fun to see him end up at a college program and have the same regard to a conference trophy as he did towards, the NFL divisional trophies. Just kind of like, hand it to him and immediately hands it off, because his goal was always to win the NFL playoff. For a lot of college coaches, I mean, the top college coaches, Kalen DeBoer, I mean, or let's set him aside. Let's say Kirby Smart, the current doyen of college football right now, the peak of them all. The expectation for Georgia is he's going to win the SEC and therefore go into the playoff. And perhaps that's the extension goal, to win a few games and to make it at least to the semifinal, if not the national championship. That's going to be another thing we're going to have to weigh in here. Expectations of how far we want to see people go into the playoffs. Because towards the end of I'm saying like he's left. With Harbaugh, the last 3 times at the Apple, the first 2 times he didn't make it through the semifinal, and there were people like asking, like, does he have enough to make it to the championship game, which I felt was a little bit ridiculous, but there he did. But at this point, now that we're going to have multiple rounds, is the expectation, can you get to at least a semifinal bid? Which coaches are going to be judged by that? And there's still going to be teams like a Wake Forest or Stanford, who, and I use Stanford because they had the greatest season for this as an example, where winning a conference championship was probably the best that they are expecting. Like, I still remember 2000, it was like 2000 when, Tyrone Willingham had an 8-3 Stanford team that limped into the Rose Bowl and got absolutely blown out, but they had won the conference. So there's going to be occasionally teams like that win a conference, and that really is the best thing they hope for. But for most of the power teams, it's going to be the playoffs are an absolute expectation, and the conference championship has almost become a secondary one.
Well, I think I disagree with you. I think that when you start a season, I think that winning a conference is still the primary goal. And one of the reasons that I say that is because you are given such a tangible gift if you do win the conference. You get a bye in the college football playoff. You don't have to play a first round game. And, look, obviously a team like Georgia, they'll take their chances against a 12 or 11 seed, but it's another game that you have to play. And if you don't have to play that, right, you have an opportunity to rest, you have an opportunity to get healthy. And so I think that there's a huge advantage to winning the conference. I look back at the 2022 season where obviously we had 2 teams make the college football playoff that did not win their conference. Well, if we went into that year with the 12-team format, TCU would have had to play in the first round. Ohio State would have had to play in the first round. Does TCU make a national championship game if they aren't the 3 seed? I don't know, right? I think they would have had a chance to do it if they were the 3 seed, but they would have been pushed out. They would have been, the 5 seed or the 6 seed or something like that. And so I think that path is much more difficult, because this is the thing. I don't feel like people are appreciating enough the idea that every single team, maybe outside of the number 12 seed, which will be likely a group of 5 team, this is the top 11 teams, at least in the country. And even if you're Georgia, even if you're Alabama, even if you're Ohio State or Michigan, that's a tough game. That is a tough game that you have to go and win. And then you have to win that level of game consistently. You have to win 3 or 4 of them in a row. And so I do think that there's a lot of benefit to having to play one less than that. So when Kirby Smart goes into 2024, I absolutely expect him to say, our goal is to win the SEC. Because if you win the SEC as well, that puts you in as good a position as any to win the national championship. You're likely going to be the number 1 or number 2 seed if you win the Southeastern Conference. So I think that this format actually puts more focus on winning a conference championship than we've had for at least since the college football playoff started.
So you don't think, like, for example, and I grant that in the initial, probably near future, that's going to still be how people view it. But I wonder with 4 power conferences, presumably, as long as ACC stays together, we're going to get to a point where over time, maybe the shift of how people perceive it could go to the goal is getting the playoff. The goal is a CFP. And I wonder, especially with, as some have argued, conferences have lost their identities somewhat with, Cal and Stanford and the ACC, and obviously the additions to the Big Ten. That it is they become more of a vehicle to getting to that ultimate goal than being part of that ultimate goal, because so many of these decisions are about money, but also about perhaps buttressing yourself to be able to go for that strength. One thing that does, I admit now, I kind of wish more of the conferences kept divisions in some way, only because I was hoping we'd still have that chance for that wacky conference championship game where the favorite team gets like that. For example, let's go with, rest in peace, Big Ten divisions, but where maybe a Wisconsin does somehow upset an Ohio State. And so we get a team with like 4 or 5 losses that suddenly gets into the playoff. And, that happens in, the NFL gets all kinds of silly stuff like that. But can you imagine? That would be, I still remember, I would love to have seen the equivalent, was it 2011? Yeah, 2011 USC, where they were not allowed to go to the postseason. So UCLA, which had a losing record, or at least close to a losing record with 6 wins, ended up in the Pac-12 championship. And imagine had they won. They didn't win. Then they lost their bowl game. So I think they became the first team to ever finish the season 6-8. But imagine if that team had somehow made it through. We've lost that because now, granted, it's going to get better quality football, but it's going to be the 2 highest rated, or however each conference is doing it, in their respective title games. But we are also kind of, that's a great question. Are conference title games really just an extension of the playoff for the P4? That's almost how you have to look at it. They are just part of the process of getting in, with, of course, the added benefit that there's going to be probably a regular number of conference championship losers that are still going to end up in the playoff regardless. It just means they're going to play a first round game.
Yeah, well, and I think another way to think of it is like, I think every single year we can assume the Big Ten and SEC, we can assume, we don't have to pretend, that the Big Ten and SEC winner and loser are both going to make the college football playoff. So they're playing for a bye every year. That's what they're going to be playing for. I think usually one of the 2 losers between the Big 12 and ACC will get in as well. I think it's very likely that those 2 conferences combined will put in 3 teams. That would be my expectation. Some years it's going to be a Big 12 team. Some years it's going to be an ACC team. It just depends. I do think that in a lot of ways it is an extension, like you said. And it also buys you a bye, right? That's a huge deal. And so I do think that there's still going to be a lot of juice for these games. Like, some people are like, well, why would Georgia play their best players in the SEC title game if, why not just rest them if they're going to be in the playoff anyway? And my answer is, I just think that there's a lot of tangible benefit to not having to play another game against a top 11 opponent that could eliminate you from the season and eliminate you from the postseason. So I do think there's going to be a lot of juice with these conference championship games. Now, this gets to a bigger picture point, which is that like winning a conference of 10 teams is just a much more reasonable and realistic goal than winning a conference of 18 teams. I think that, I'm going to be curious how much involvement and excitement there is from like the middle class of these conferences when like it's basically impossible in the SEC or Big Ten to come from the middle and win. It's just, the path is so hard now. But that's more of a conversation for another day. To take us back a little bit to the cycle and the calendar, another thing I'm going to be really interested in is, so one thing, for example, is Ohio State would have been in the college football playoff this year in a 12-team field. So does Kyle McCord stick around in that scenario? Does he transfer before? We haven't seen a scenario where good players have left before the playoff. And another thing to mention is their window, I think, would reopen as soon as their season is over. So they would be able to play in the playoff game and then transfer. But the issue is, if you're a quarterback like Kyle McCord, are you worried that the spots are filled up by the time that you're entering the transfer portal? Do you want to enter earlier? It's a strange situation. And again, these transfer windows were obviously put in place so that we wouldn't have to do everything all the time. But when teams have such disparate calendars, again, does it end up putting a player like Kyle McCord in a situation where he has to consider not participating as a starting quarterback in the college football playoff?
Yeah, it really does feel like, and I always caution people who ask who get worried about it. We're still learning. It seems like everyone's still learning as they go along. We still haven't entirely figured out the best way to use the portal. No one has. There will be that year to year, wow, that team really used it well, but then you'll see another team where it doesn't quite have the same results. Or NIL. heaven knows everyone's still learning how NIL works, and Florida State apparently is getting punished for it. No one's even sure how that works. So the calendar, I think, is going to have to. I could see the calendar shifting as they move along, as long as. And I'm hoping, and I think the powers that be have the ability to say, we're still learning it. We don't have the right answer yet. Let's shift this to match the extended playoff. But given how things change in college football, there'll probably be one or two really clunky years where what you're talking about happens. And then they go back and fix it. Unfortunately, now we're not going to have Nick Saban to be the one initially yelling about it, and that causes everyone to kind of fall in line. I mean, that's why everyone thinks he'd be a wonderful hypothetical commissioner of college football if there ever was one, because everyone's going to trust him on how things should be done. And I still love it. It's going to be that paternalistic thing he kind of did. Well, if you want to change the rules to this, you're going to regret it, but we're going to do it the best way we can in Alabama. I mean, he's going to be the guy to do that with everything. But yeah, no, I think this calendar is and one thing that struck me, I mean, I'm on good terms with a current NFL assistant coach, and I was, he's now done. His season's done. They didn't go to the playoff, but he's like, I'm gonna go. Like, I don't even talk to him about football. He does not want to talk about football at this point in the season. He's like, I'm gonna go relax, enjoy my time, have a break, whatever. And I thought about, so many college football coaches don't really get that opportunity, because I mean, this cycle, it's always be recruiting, always be, as you said, the next transfer portal window's coming, later on. But there's going to be back channel conversations. Everyone's going to be kind of having chats. Alabama wants to now probably backfill some of the people they may have lost. They can't really do it right now because none of the other teams can lose. Like, those players can't leave. They're going to be constantly in that conversation. And I believe it was Kirby Smart, but other head coaches have mentioned that the burnout is going to eventually take place. And that, for a sport that is now finally, I think, doing a fairly good job of embracing the idea of mental health for players, coaches, especially these young guys, and we talk so much about the top teams that can afford to pay their coaches so much that even a head coach going to another team to be a position coach can be a comparable salary. But for a lot of programs, like if you're, a G5 assistant coach, you're not getting a whole lot of money. And not to say like at FCS, they're also working like really well. They're working hard and they're not getting that kind of money. And what it's demanding on some of these guys is incredible year round. I do wonder, and this is again another conversation I've had with this same assistant, somebody pointed out like the overall life expectancy for football coaches at these high levels is actually lower than average. And I could see the stress that we're putting them under is a part of that. And again, I do know, and I do acknowledge the counter argument, which is especially in the top level. I mean, you're getting paid a ton of money. I mean, there's surgeons that work in the emergency room every year, every day that get close to that level of salary, and they're also under a lot of stress. I mean, I accept that, but at the same time, this is getting a little bit crazy, even for college football, even for a sport that is theoretically started as a hobby for people. When we think about college football, it's like athletics. I do worry about that, and I wonder if we'll see some shifts also just for the mental health of the people who are coaching it.
No, I mean, and I think that people, especially on the internet, like, there is obviously this thought that, well, you get paid all this money, and so like we should just accept that things are terrible for what we ask some of these coaches to do in terms of how on we ask them to be, the time we ask them to spend away from their family. Like, this is supposed to be college amateur athletics, right? Now we can obviously have the conversation that it's not fully amateur, but like, imagine, like you said, your NFL assistant coach friend, if he had to like convince his players that they should stay every year after they leave. That's not their job. That's the job of a general manager. That's the job of a director of player personnel. That's not like the wide receiver coach's job to say, hey, Justin Jefferson, please don't just leave because you feel like it, because you think that maybe someone right now will give you more money even though you're under contract, right? Like, this is not normal. And we can say that it's bad even though they get paid handsome salaries to do it. The other thing too is, and let's maybe take our focus and kind of look at some of these jobs that have of course opened. I mean, everybody can point to Alabama's going to pay Ryan Grubb more than $2 million to be an assistant coach, most likely, right? They hired away Buffalo's sitting head coach. Like, this stuff is obviously good for these guys. I'll tell you who this isn't good for. Like, Buffalo's wide receivers coach or defensive line coach is probably making more like, low six figures. Not bad money. Like, nobody should feel like they're living in poverty, but also that is not like, oh, I lost my job and it's no big deal kind of money either. And those are the people whose lives are really kind of flipped around by all of this, because there's not as many openings right now. A lot of these jobs have been made. A lot of these hires have been made. A lot of opportunities for advancement are gone right now. And again, we have a couple of openings right now. Like I said, we're recording middle of the day on Wednesday. Some of these might be filled by the time that you hear this. We don't have control over the college football hiring cycle, but Buffalo, South Alabama, San Jose State, all open right now. Arizona and Washington were open or just filled. Like, it's a lot of movement to be happening in the middle of January when you're kind of supposed to be looking forward to the season.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.
One thing, as we kind of look into the 12-team playoff era and the nature of the transfer portal and coaching moves, is how much we're going to, I wonder how Machiavellian it's going to get. I wonder how because people are going to be looking out for themselves. And I completely respect that, particularly the players, because for the longest time, they got the short end of the stick when coaches move. But how much of the coaching hiring is now going to also shift to, can you get someone and bring some players with them? I mean, I think the first poster child for it was Lincoln Riley coming over and bringing Caleb Williams and a couple of other guys with him. Because suddenly, not only was USC great, but it was the same guy that came with Lincoln Riley. And I don't get me wrong, I doubt that USC hired Lincoln Riley and like hinged Caleb Williams coming with him on it. I think Lincoln Riley had enough of a reputation at that point to be worth hiring. But are we going to see more of that? Like, if you were, because that's been a conversation, is, Jedd Fisch going to bring Fifita and a couple of those receivers with them. Sounds like they might stay. When we'll see. Everyone, again, I'm always very cynical and skeptical until people we're already playing the next season and those guys stayed, but I wonder how much of that we're going to see, how much, and it gets into an interesting question too, because with how college football, again, is not quite as organized, will we get some really angry teams, angry boosters starting to sue each other, for sue another team, potentially frivolous lawsuit, but it'll gum up the works. Or I wouldn't say frivolous, but meritless, that might end up having no merit, to just try and take revenge, like, interference with another team. I mean, can you have tortious interference of the business affairs of another college football program because you hired their coach who then took all the players with them? I don't know. I mean, we all wonder that. And people have tried to, I think we've talked about it in a previous show, people have tried to come up with ways of keeping players at their home base, kind of keeping them from following a head coach. But that one doesn't sit well with me, because, I mean, if you are a player who went to play for a coach and that coach leaves and he still wants you, by all means, follow him. I think that's great. But how much of that are we going to see weaponizing those moves, where suddenly you're going to not only see a coach move, but raid the pantry on their way out?
Well, I do take issue with one thing that you said. This trend obviously started with Zach Kitley and Bailey Zappi going from Houston Christian University to Western Kentucky. They're the real pioneers here. But I think that, look, there is not right now a legal way to prevent this. We are seeing all these plans proposed of, maybe we should ban players from being able to follow their coaches to a place. Maybe we should ban where whether players can enter the portal. Well, the way that you do that is by collectively bargaining a contract and treating your players as employees, yeah. And that's not something that at this point anybody has been interested in doing. Yes, so that's the real answer to this situation. Or even if it's a collective bargaining, even if it doesn't result in employee status, I think that it still requires a level of collective bargaining, and it requires a representative agency for the players and for college football as a whole as well. So that's, I think, a bigger picture conversation. I think we could get to that point in the next couple of years, but it's not going to happen in the next 2 to 3. We're talking the next 10 to 20 when we're talking about that kind of conversation. I do think that, look, there are ways for schools to fight back as well. We are seeing right now that that Arizona, it seems like their NIL collective is trying to stand up right now, right? I think that Brent Brennan's come in. The first clip that I saw after his press conference was Brent Brennan's wife, who, by the way, new coach at Arizona. His wife is an Arizona alum. His brother played at Arizona. And the first clip that I saw was Brent Brennan's wife going out on the golf cart with Noah Fafita, Arizona's star quarterback. So, like, the pitch is already on to try to keep these guys around. And that's part of the job too, right? Like that is part of the job, is when you hire somebody, you do have to have an understanding of whether they're going to be able to make a pitch to keep your roster together and keep your players around. We can have conversations about guys following their coaches through wherever, but like plenty don't. Plenty choose to stay, and plenty choose to stay with the university that they're at. And part of this does come down to, you do have to make a coach that understands at least the general, tenor of your roster. And I think that, let's talk about some of these hires real quick. So Washington decides to stay in the old Pac-12. They take Jedd Fisch from Arizona. From what it sounds like, so he's going to be paid $7.75 million a year, a really, really good salary, even for like a Big Ten level coach. From what it sounded like, Arizona did not make signing him to a new contract as much of a priority as maybe they thought that they should have.
They couldn't. That was their problem.
Right.
They misplaced $240 million. Well, they didn't misplace it. They came up with a budget that had $240 million they never had.
Yeah.
And so the school's got bigger problems right now. This couldn't have happened at a worse time for them.
So they were planning on upping his salary into the mid fives. So like they were going to give him a raise. And they were going to try to keep him around. But like you said, they've got some bigger fish to fry right now. Now, it's worth saying, right? Like, they're not going to avoid paying a coach market value because of this, because that money comes from boosters and outside sources anyway. But the question is, okay, if you're Jedd Fisch and you're sitting here, there's a hiring freeze right now. There's travel freezes. I don't know how that impacts your recruiting budget. I don't know how that impacts your ability to retain coaches. We just saw his defensive coordinator leave for a position coach job at the University of Texas. Now, there's some conversation that actually Brennan might try to bring Johnny Nansen back from Texas. We'll see if that ends up happening. But there's a lot of complications there as to why maybe Arizona's in a unique position right now. Again, like I said, Noah Fafita, Techaroya, McMillan, they've had conversations about coming back. If they come back, I think a lot of players will come back as well. But looking at Washington, very different style of coach than what they did before, right? Jedd Fisch comes from more of an NFL background. He was hired after being quarterbacks coach of the New England Patriots back in 2020 and took over at Arizona. And he brought kind of a pro style mindset into it. Like, he kind of did what Herm Edwards said he was going to do, but like in a normal way and not an insane way, where they kind of view it as a very much like player acquisition, NFL development type factory. That's how they wanted to develop things, and also with some creative scheme and concepts. So I think that's going to fit Washington pretty well. And I think that for me, my only surprise was that Jedd Fisch moved right now. He's a Florida alum. He's a Florida guy. He's from that area. I thought that maybe he would stick around and wait to see if that opens next year. But Washington's a really good job, regardless of the fact that they lost their coach to the University of Alabama. And so I like the hire. What do you think?
Oh, I think it's a decent hire. I think Jedd Fisch has that ability to coach it's so funny to say coach in the Pac-12. I mean, coach right now in the Big Ten. I think Washington will give him just the next step up of support and facilities and the ability to support him. Again, what Arizona really got caught with their pants down with what was going on in the rest of the campus. I think he's a good hire. My only concern, and I know I've heard it voiced elsewhere, is will he then bolt for Florida if the job were to open up? Granted, he could completely kill his opportunity if he doesn't continue a certain level of success at Washington, because Washington has historically been one of the top Pac-10, Pac-8. Like, it's historically been one of the top teams in that conference. I mean, battling with USC historically, but they've got a national championship. They've had plenty of Rose Bowls. They've had plenty of opportunities to reach that height. So the expectations at Washington are certainly historically higher than they ever were at Arizona. I think he's a good hire. But again, he also has a tough act to follow, because he's not going to have Penix there anymore. He's not going to have the same level of caliber players that briefly helped. You could argue really were the reason why this Washington team went as far as they did, but he's proven he can do it. If they'll give him the patience Arizona gave him. Now, I'm not saying he's going to have as terrible a season to open up, because he inherited a really awful situation at Arizona. I think he's a good hire, and I think he can continue them going. He isn't, necessarily a sexy hire, but that's not necessarily what you need. And it'll be interesting to see how he goes. I'm actually really curious to see how Brent Brennan's going to do replacing him at Arizona, because arguably it was kind of a weird side. Again, as you said, people wanted him. He's got connections to the school through his extended family. He's also the cousin of Colt Brennan. I remember when I finally found that out, I was absolutely fascinated. I did not realize they were related. But the one concern I have there is if he, has he done enough to prove that he can get Arizona to be a competitive team in the Big 12? Because, I mean, right now he's at a stage where the playoffs are a possibility. San Jose State, to be charitable, extremely outside chance of ever getting the playoff as the G5 candidate. We all, or G6, however you want to phrase it, candidate. But at Arizona, now that's something that's on the table. Can he win the Big 12? Can he get the Wildcats into that spot, which certainly historically they've been able to make their way into the New Year's Six before. Can they now do that under Brent Brennan? And seeing what he did at San Jose State, it's always tricky. It's a tough place to win. Getting 7 wins there is a bit of a triumph. He had a great season under the pandemic year when everything's hard to gauge in the pandemic year. But I'm not sure. I mean, and it says something that you get somebody who can do a lot with little to a school like Arizona that just had all their financial issues. You kind of that's not quite, I know that's not how they want to frame it, because he was a finalist for the job when Jedd Fisch got it. But I'm curious to see how he follows there too, because we can't discount the fact that Arizona now is also a team that is fighting for a playoff spot. I'm very curious to see how these two work out.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is when this hire happened, I think a lot of people jumped online and were like, they're hiring the 34 and 48 San Jose State coach, which one I think shows just a general lack of understanding of what San Jose State is and has been and what he's working with. The other part too is, he was hired in 2017 without any head coach experience. I think he had been a co-OC like 1 year of his career. So he was very green when he was hired as a head coach. And in his first 2 years, he went 3-22 and 2-14 in conference. And since then, he's been really good. And even if you want to put that pandemic season aside, like at San Jose State, it's 5-7, 5-7, 7-5, 7-6. It's the first time that they've had back-to-back winning seasons at San Jose State since 1992. So I think that regardless of whether that pandemic season was real or not, he's brought stability and he's brought consistency and he's leveraged it into something. The other thing you have to if you are Arizona, is that he's done a great job with quarterbacks. Chevin Cordero has been his quarterback, I believe, both of the last 2 years. A really, really good player. Nick Starkel, he was able to develop into some of his best seasons. I think that he was also Josh Love's coach and did a good job with him a couple of years ago. So if you're Noah Fafita, I think you have to like what his track record is with quarterbacks and passing offenses. The hires are going to be important. The staff is going to be important. I think, we mentioned some of Arizona's kind of university-wide issues. I think that made this hire and job kind of just a little weird, right? Even for me, I put together, I was part of putting together our candidates list for Arizona. Not a lot of obvious candidates for this job, right? Both their offensive and defensive coordinator were under consideration. It's just this is one of those jobs because they've been a bad team for most of the past 15 years outside of like some really nice years under Rich Rod, and like it's just not a place that's had a lot of consistent success. And so I think to get somebody who's been a head coach, who's done more with less, like you said, who's brought consistency and stability to a place, and also who I think is poised to be able to keep the roster together mostly if he can get some hires right. There's a lot to like. We'll see if it comes through.
This is something that gets funny because we always think about when you really start watching college football, sometimes um, determines your views on certain teams. So I got into college football when Arizona was the Desert Swarm team, when they were really good. When in 1998, that first season of the BCS, there were so many, the ramifications people don't talk about because that final regular season, well, it was conference championship weekend, but the Pac-10 didn't have a conference championship game. So UCLA, BCS number 2, plays that game against Miami, which is a hurricane makeup game. Miami pulls the upset, knocks UCLA out of the BCS, and Kansas State lost, knocked them out of the BCS, and Florida State was a sacrificial lamb against Tennessee. But what happened when UCLA lost was they suddenly went to the Rose Bowl, which, to the horror of Arizona, they were going to go, and they still never did. That was going to be what would have been their only close chance to get into the Rose Bowl game, and they didn't get to go because UCLA lost. So it's just fascinating, but I've always been thinking like, wow, Arizona's a scary team. And then over the years, that's certainly they completely kind of returned to something that has been a struggle for a lot of those programs. Before we wrap up, and acknowledging there are at least 3 openings as we're talking about this, and potentially a big 4th opening that's going to be coming up. Who do you think are, if you don't necessarily want to say your ultimate winner, but who have been your top tier hires in this coaching carousel cycle, which does stretch back quite far when we think about how many months have passed?
What year is it again? I don't even know, like what or I don't even know. That's a good question. I think that one that comes to mind for me is Jonathan Smith going to Michigan State from Oregon State. He has done an unbelievable job. I think that just with that slightly more resourced type program, I think that's going to be huge for them. We saw them jump in and get an Aiden Shiles from the portal, right? Like they've done a good job in the portal, adding some real talent. So that's a hire that I like a lot. I think that's going to end up working a little off key. And by the way, I actually think that this cycle, for the most part, like it's not spectacular, but there have just been some really good hires, I think. And I think that even some of the hires that were just made, like Jedd Fisch, like Kalen DeBoer, and like Brent Brennan, like it's just like quiet competence, which I like a lot. I'm excited to see what Fran Brown can do at Syracuse. Georgia DB's coach, one of the best recruiters in the nation. People joke that he's the king of Jersey with the way that he recruits that state. We've already seen some early results with them landing some big time players in the transfer portal. So I'm excited to see. We'll see what Kyle McCord can do in that offense. And I think that you also have to look at Kurt Signetti at Indiana. I mean, he did such a great job during his time at James Madison. Again, just adds a level of quiet competence. So honestly, there are very few hires I didn't like this year. Like, I mean, again, Mike Elko at Texas A&M, I love that. Kalen DeBoer at Alabama, it's unique, but I like it. Like, it's been, I think, a pretty just solid year overall. That I mean, I think back to like the last couple of years. Usually, there's 1 or 2 that are just like, what the hell is that? And I don't feel like that really happens.
The Charlie Weiss to Kansas Award, like that seemed to me that's the marquee of like, what, really? And then it went exactly as expected. Do you think Washington is somewhat annoyed that Jonathan Smith came off the board when he did? Because would he have been someone they would he have been their go-to guy had they had the opportunity to go after him?
I think he would have been under consideration. I think that him and Jedd Fisch probably would have both been candidates for them. So it's a small loss. I don't think it's like a crazy loss. The other thing I'll say too, and I mean, obviously, like East Lansing is a pretty big city, but like I got a chance to talk to Jonathan Smith earlier this year when I was writing a story about Oregon State and Washington State. And like I think he likes a little bit of a lower key quality of life. Like I think that I think that like for him, he liked that he could be in a place with few distractions at Oregon State. Now, obviously, he was offensive coordinator at Washington as well, so he has experience under Chris Peterson. But I think that Michigan State might fit him just a little bit better, and I think that Jedd Fisch might fit Washington just a little bit better. Though, I mean, he absolutely would have been maybe top of my list if I was hiring out Washington as well.
Yeah, I like a lot of your choices for good hires. Only one I'm going to throw in, and this is more of, I just liked interviewing the couple of times I've talked to him, and Willie Fritz at Houston. I think it's more that I just want to see him continue proving that he can succeed at any level he goes to. But I think that's a good spot to kind of slowly wrap this up. This is the College Football Survivor Show. We always love the fact that you all join us for this, and I wanted to thank all of you for joining us in our conversations. I wanted to thank our producer, Joey Aliberti. Be sure, if you get a chance, to like, rate, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And find us, check us out on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show. He's Shehan Jeyarajah. You can find his work at cbssports.com and Shehan Jeyarajah on X and TikTok. I'm Bobak Hayeri. Thanks for joining us.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.